Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I can see that people are joining us in the Zoom room and the number of guests is climbing. And so, welcome everybody. I'm thrilled to have you here today. My name is Paula Price. I am a lawyer turned coach for lawyers, and I am your presenter today for our webinar. And we are talking about the transition from law school to law firm, how to thrive as a summer student. And this is the second webinar in a two-part series where the first webinar was about some of the foundational skills that I think are essential for students and lawyers at all stages to really master in order to thrive in a law firm environment. And today we're talking about this second stage, which is really about implementation. And the way that I've described the webinar is becoming a trusted go-to, because that is terminology that I think is quite familiar, right? When you refer to somebody as a go-to, it means they are a trusted source, somebody that we go to help us solve the problems. And as a student, as a lawyer, you want to become that go-to for your clients. So, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm thrilled to have you here. We are going to dive straight in. If you are new to Zoom, which my guess is that you are not, then you might benefit from some additional instruction re the toolbar. But what I will say that may be different from other webinars is number one, this is a webinar format, so you can see me, but I cannot see you and you cannot see each other. So I've set it up this way on purpose so that you can participate anonymously if you like. So please do submit questions if you'd like to ask questions as we go through today's session. You can do that using the Q&A feature on the Zoom toolbar. The questions will be seen by me only. You can submit them with your name or anonymously. I will not read out your name. And you're also welcome to participate in the chat. So you are in the right place today if you are a law student working at a law firm. Now, this also applies if you're a law student and you are thinking about working at a law firm next summer and you're trying to get a heads up in terms of what you can expect. So those categories, amazing. You might also be a practicing lawyer. So you might be a year into practice, several years into practice. You might be a newly called lawyer. You might be an articling student. What we talk about today will be relevant and applicable to you as well. But the examples that I'm using are specifically tailored to law students who are doing their first summer at a law firm. Now, you want to become a trusted go-to at your firm, and what you want are skills that will help you go from knowledge to action. And what I mean by this is that as law students, as new lawyers, often you might feel like you think you know the answer. You know the answer. You know what you should be doing. But there's a gap between knowing what you should do or knowing what you want to do and actually taking action. And today's webinar is designed to help you bridge that gap. So you'll see in a minute the topics that we're going to cover. I'd love for you to keep that in mind. There are three main areas that we're going to focus on today. Number one is mindset. So I will be taking you on an introduction, perhaps, to a growth mindset, what that means, and why it's important for law students and for lawyers in practice. We're going to talk about feedback, and I'll share some insights about feedback generally. And we're also going to talk about feedback specifically in a law firm environment and how you can use that to support your growth. We're going to talk about communication, which is an essential skill for building trust, for building relationships within your law firm. And there will be time for questions as well. So if you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A as we go through today's webinar, because when I see those questions, either I can answer them in the moment or we can save them until the end. So I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Now, maybe just a few words about me before we dive into the substance. If you're new to me, I am a coach for lawyers. What that means is that I help lawyers at all stages. So I do work with some law students. I do presentations, for example, at law schools to help with networking or how to interview, skills that are really applicable from that student to getting that first job stage. And then I work with law students at firms, so summer students, articling students. I work with lawyers at all levels of call, associates, partners, depending on what they are seeking help with. And a good portion of my work is with lawyers who are in law firms who are seeking coaching to help support their professional development within the firm. So the information that I'm sharing with you is relevant to you as you are in your firm. I have a background as a lawyer. I practiced for many years, mostly in big law as a commercial litigator, which means that I understand the context that you're working in. I understand that not all advice or suggestions that a coach gives a client are going to be relevant or applicable in the environment that you're in. And I've heard that feedback from my clients. They appreciate the fact that I understand where they're coming from. I understand what you are coming from. I was a summer student way back in 2002. It's been a while. I've worked with summer students more recently, and I have been in your shoes. And so the information that I'm sharing with you, the tools that I'm sharing, they are being shared with you in a way that is relevant to what is going on for you in your practice. So, the first area that we are going to focus on is mindset. We're going to talk about a growth mindset. We're going to talk about indicia, what is a growth mindset. And then finally, we're going to talk about mindset forks. That is a terminology that I came up with in preparing for today's webinar. You'll see why we're talking about forks in a minute, but I'd love for you to keep that idea of forks in mind as a bit of as a prompt for you when you find yourself in practice and we're looking to apply that growth mindset. So growth mindset is a term. Now, if you are in person, I would ask you to show by raising your hand how many of you have heard of a growth mindset. So you're welcome to put that in the chat if you like, if you've heard of a growth mindset. Okay, I see that we have someone who has raised their hand. Now, I don't know what that means exactly, so I'm going to invite you to put your comment in the chat if you've raised your hand, just so that I know what to make of that. Um, Growth mindset is a term that was coined by Carol Dweck, who is a doctor. She's an American psychologist who wrote a book called Mindset, and it's all about the way that we think. Now, just going back to this first slide, one thing I wanted to mention is the fact that I put an iceberg here for a reason. When it comes to the way that you act in a law firm, the steps that you take, which is really what I'm focused on helping you with today, right? Those steps that are going to move you forward and help you learn and grow. We look at those actions as being important, significant, because they have an impact on the real world. And the reason that I'm starting with mindset is because that is what's going to determine whether or not you take action. So in the image of this iceberg, you can see there's a lot going on underneath the surface that you don't see. If you think about the actions as being what the portion of the iceberg that rests above the surface of the water, the actions are being driven by something that is much deeper than that. So that's why we're starting with mindset. The way that you think is going to determine the way that you act. So, growth mindset, in the definition that is coined by Carol Dweck, is a mindset. It is the belief that intelligence and abilities can be developed over time. So, you will likely hear growth mindset distinguished from a fixed mindset. And when I first heard of these two mindsets, it really resonated with me because I absolutely had for most of my life a fixed mindset. So a growth mindset is the belief that your abilities and intelligence can develop through effort, feedback, and learning, right? So you may have been told you're really smart, right? And you think that being really smart is something that is innate, it can't be changed. And when you feel like you're trying to be smart, then you might shy away from taking risks that would prove otherwise. That's when you get into a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset assumes that your skills are set, right? Your talent is innate or there's no talent at all. So you're either good at something or you're not good at it. And when you have a growth mindset, you view learning and mistakes as part of the process, learning and growth. If you have a fixed mindset, you see mistakes as a sign that proof that you are not good enough and that you should avoid doing the thing that you're doing. So the perfectionist mindset, I think, really ties in with the fixed mindset where you're striving so hard to maintain a perfect record that you don't necessarily take the risks that are going to help you grow. And what I'm here to help you focus on is how are you going to grow, right? We know that you are smart. We know that you are talented. We know that you're capable. That is how you got here in the first place. And maybe there are parts of you that already have a growth mindset in place, right? That ability and desire to strive and learn and challenge yourself. And if the term growth mindset is new to you, what I'm hoping is that it crystallizes for you concepts and ways of thinking that may already be innate to you. So, if we go deeper into what a growth mindset means, I've set this out as a chart, and you can see that a fixed mindset means thinking that your intelligence is fixed versus a growth mindset, you can change how intelligent you are. A fixed mindset is that if you struggle, it's a sign that you lack intelligence. And if you struggle in a growth mindset, it means that you're learning. Now, if any of you has ever learned a new language, you might relate to this, right? I took French for years, and although I was excellent in the written language, I understood the grammar nearly perfectly. I had a really hard time actually speaking with others because I became very self-conscious at a certain point about my accent. If it wasn't perfect, I didn't want to say it at all. That is a fixed mindset. The growth mindset, you're going to go speak anyways. And what you'll notice is for people who really learn a new language, because they're willing to speak. That's what I want for you. Mistakes are a sign that you're not capable. You should quit. Again, that's the mindset, the fixed mindset. And then we have the growth mindset where we just think of mistakes differently. It's a part of growth. You can study and learn from them. And then finally, in a fixed mindset, you avoid the challenges so you can keep your perfect record versus a growth mindset where you seek out challenges so you can improve. That again gets to the heart of what we're looking at today. So, to bring this into action, which ultimately is where I'm going here, it occurred to me that it might be helpful to think of your journey as a lawyer as the hero's journey. Because as you transition from your law school into a law firm environment, you are going through a transition, right? There is this call to adventure where you're entering into the unknown. And throughout your career, this is going to continue to happen because as a professional, as a practitioner, your practice will always be evolving. You will be faced with new, greater challenges. And so, by adopting a growth mindset, what you're really doing is developing a meta skill that will help you every time you have a new challenge faced ahead of you, right? If somebody asks you to do something you've never done before, you've been given a file where you're going to court, you're leading the deal, you are doing something that is challenging, I would love to instill in you this idea that this is a call to adventure and that you are going to approach it with a growth mindset. So here we've got the image of the hero's journey. I'm not going to go into it in any detail except to say that we and you are probably familiar with this idea that the hero's journey isn't, you know, the assignment came your way. It was really easy. You did everything perfectly the first time. Everybody was happy and on you went. Yes, that happens. And there are also times where you receive the assignment, you have no idea where to begin. Every place you look turns out to be a dead end. You go and speak to your mentor, they point you in a fresh direction. All of a sudden, you understand the problem differently, or you see what the solution is, and you're able to produce an amazing product and you come out the other side. So, again, the idea that things are going to go smoothly with no challenges is not a reflection of what's going to happen. And so we want to set you up for that hero's journey time and again. So let's bring this to the idea of a mindset fork. The idea here is that there are going to be forks in the road every day when you are in practice in your law firm environment where there are opportunities for you to apply a growth mindset and opportunities where you can apply that fixed mindset and shy away from opportunities. So what I've done here is set up a contrast between a growth mindset student, we'll call her Jane, and a fixed mindset student, we'll call him Jim, and the difference between the two. So if you imagine they step into the firm, they're in the same school, they have similar capabilities. Let's say they have their first assignment, and we've got Jane here, and she gets her first assignment. She doesn't exactly understand what's being asked of her. So she asks questions to clarify what the assignment means, and she's able to deliver a product that meets the expectations of the assigning lawyer. Now, Jim, on the other hand, received an assignment. He didn't understand really what was going on. He didn't want to appear like he didn't know what he was doing, or maybe he assumed that he should have understood. So he went down a different path, and it turns out that he wasn't on the right path. And so, because he didn't clarify what the instructions were, he ended up delivering something that didn't quite work out. He had to redo the assignment. Now, in the growth mindset example again, let's say you've got an assignment that you submit to your instructing lawyer. You might ask for feedback. There may be other opportunities along the way where you can seek out feedback and learn from it. And we're going to talk about that a bit more in the later section of this webinar. So as a result, you start to learn based on the feedback that you're receiving. Now, in Jim's case, he's avoiding feedback, right? He's not asking for it. He doesn't really want the feedback. And if he gets feedback that feels like criticism, he's taking it personally. And instead of dealing with it, he's kind of avoiding it. Again, you're going to end up in two very different places. In the growth mindset, we have Jane sticking her hand up for new types of work, right? Maybe she's going to volunteer on a litigation mandate where she's going to maybe speak to an uncontested application, or she's going to um, volunteer to lead a team, or she's going to put her hand up for something that feels a little bit uncomfortable as something that she's not done before, and she's going to put herself in that challenge because she wants to learn versus a student or a lawyer who sticks with what's familiar. Maybe they just want to write the memos or do tasks that they've already done before because it's familiar and they know they can do it really, really well. And so you want to ask yourself what approach you are taking because your learning will happen at a much more rapid pace if you're taking on those new challenges. In Jane's case, she's asking to be involved in real world interactions. Can I go with you to that client meeting? Can I go with you to court? Can I sit in on that discovery? Versus waiting, right? And the trouble with waiting is that you might get invited and you might get lots of chances to go along. You may have more opportunities if you're willing to put yourself out there and ask to join. Now, again, going back to growth mindset versus fixed mindset, Jane looks at mistakes as an opportunity to learn. So she takes the feedback, she takes the mistakes, she studies them, and she doesn't make them again. She figures out what went wrong, and then she's learned from that. Versus we've got Jim who sees the mistakes as failure and he's not doing anything about it, right? Maybe he shies away, he stops working with somebody, he avoids the situation altogether. So we want to maximize those mistakes if they happen. I'm not saying that we want mistakes to happen, but if they do happen, let's use them as learning opportunities. And then finally, this sort of general approach in a growth mindset, you might view your summer as a learning opportunity. You might look at your career as an opportunity to learn and grow versus looking at the summer as a test to pass, right? You're sitting there defending your title instead of getting out there and figuring out what you can learn. So the exercise for this section, and I should say, I will give you a copy of the slides. And so you do not need to memorize or write down everything that we're saying. One thing I neglected to do at the beginning is to welcome everybody who's watching the recording. So welcome if you are watching the recording. There will be a copy of the slides provided along with the recording. And if anybody doesn't have access to that, just send me a note, send me an email. I will send those to you. The exercise here is identify three things you want to learn this summer. Let's get you into that practice, into the habit of thinking about proactively what you want to learn. And this, again, applies to all stages of your career, right? For the summer, you're going to be thinking about the next few months. When you come back as an articling student, you'll have a checklist submitted by the Law Society, and you'll also want to be intentional about where you want to focus your attention. in our first webinar, if you had a chance to watch that, we focused on three areas: your skills, we focused on practice management and developing relationships. So here, I'd encourage you to think about three things that you want to learn this summer, and then what statements will support you. And GM stands for growth mindset. Here, I'd love for you to start developing an internal dialogue that supports a growth mindset. So, the kinds of questions that you'll be asking yourself, or the kind of statements you'll be telling yourself, every expert was once a beginner. I don't know how to do this yet. If you look at Carol Dweck and her work, she has a TED Talk that's excellent, and it's called The Power of Yet. She talks about the power of yet. Yet means yes, you don't have that skill currently, and there is still time. You can still develop it. I'll figure this out one step at a time. This is hard because I'm growing and I choose progress over perfection. So these are just ideas in terms of the internal messaging you can provide to yourself. The goal here, for me at least, in terms of our discussion today, is to help you identify some some mantras, some words you can use for yourself that encourage you to take that step, right? If you think about being at a fork in the road, you've got the option of doing the thing that is familiar. You've done it before. You're 100% confident you could do it again, no problem. And there's this opportunity. It might instill a bit of fear. It's new. It's challenging. It's pushing you. It's a stretch assignment. What I'm inviting you to do is to take those challenges on when you're at that fork. And in order to help you do that, have an internal dialogue that's going to support you in those decisions. And feel free to drop in the chat any mantras or words that you find encouraging. So we're going to jump into feedback. And again, if you've got questions, feel free to share them. I would love to answer them for you. In terms of feedback, we're going to talk a bit about the definition of feedback. I'm going to share a resource, actually, an excellent resource that talks about feedback. Then we're going to get really specific about what feedback looks like in a law firm. I'm going to give you some tangible tips for how to get and use feedback. And then I'm going to share a feedback hack, three questions you can ask yourself to elicit feedback. You can also ask those questions of others. The idea here is we want to get you thinking about feedback and how you can integrate that into your practice. What you'll probably find for yourself and for others is that you're busy. And feedback often isn't an essential thing, right? Or we don't think of it as being essential. And so it can get skipped over. So people get busy, you're in the middle of a huge closing, there's not time for feedback. Let's think about how you can start integrating and creating time for feedback. So, what feedback is, I mean, it really is a simple concept. It's information about reactions to, in this case, a person's performance of a task. That's how we're talking about it here, which is used as a basis for improvement. That's really all it is. Now, I've put a link here to an article which I was absolutely delighted to discover online this morning. It was originally published in the Harvard Business Review in 2019. I've got a hard copy. I've created a PDF, and it's an article that I refer often to lawyers that I work with because to me it is one of the most brilliant pieces of writing on feedback, and there are so many amazing points in it. So there's the URL. You can go look that up after our webinar. And the article about feedback is so good because it highlights some things about feedback that I think everybody needs to know and understand, especially if you are in a high performance environment and you're trying to figure out what to make of feedback and how to use it most effectively. So when you read this article, and I highly recommend you do, what you will learn is that feedback is inherently biased. This is called the source of truth theory. And what this means is that everybody who gives feedback does so with a bias, and that bias is inherent and it cannot be trained out of you. This is something you probably have already known or seen intuitively. I like to think about tipping at a restaurant. Some people are going to tip generously because that's who they are, regardless of whether the service was poor or outstanding. They've kind of got a range that is their range, right? Same is true with feedback. What you will find is that there will be lawyers and clients who love working with you, who think everything you do is perfect. And there may be others who have feedback that's a little bit different, right? Maybe it's a bit more critical. Maybe they don't see it the same way. And so the reason this is important is that it helps for you to contextualize that feedback that you receive it does need to be taken with a grain of salt in the sense that one person's opinion, one person's feedback isn't everybody's opinion. Now, if this person is your direct boss, if you do all of your work with one person in particular, their feedback will have more impact on you than the feedback of somebody who maybe you work with once in a blue moon or who you never work with. And if you find yourself in a working environment and you have one person that you're primarily working with, and the feedback is really harsh and really critical, you may be in a situation where you need to make a change, right? That this isn't going to change. But you might also be in a situation where the feedback is constructive. You can use it to help you learn and grow. So, what I'm trying to say here is take that feedback with a grain of salt. One person's opinion isn't doesn't mean that you will not be successful elsewhere if what you receive is negative feedback. And I have seen this time and again with lawyers who may not thrive in one environment and they thrive in another environment. So we don't want to get too down about negative feedback. And we also want to bear in mind that that feedback can be really constructive. And I'll give you a few suggestions on how to deal with difficult feedback, but it can be constructive. It's always a learning opportunity. And we always want to bear in mind that it is inherently biased. And if it's your client and your dream client, your ideal client, yes, we want to take their feedback seriously. And we also want to hold it in the back of our mind that it is their feedback, right? It is personal to them. Now, the second point that comes up in this article is that criticism, right? Criticism as a form of feedback triggers a response, a stress response and inhibits learning. So again, I encourage you to go back to the article to read what they have to say about this. It is absolutely fascinating and it goes into detail about the physiological response that occurs when you receive negative feedback. And this really boils down to that fight or flight response being triggered where your sympathetic nervous system activates. It might make it harder for you to access your creativity in that moment. So let's say you're in a performance review setting or you're receiving critical feedback from somebody, there is a physiological response that will happen in your body. And it's important to know that because what that means is that you might find it difficult to process that information in the moment. You may not know what to do with it. That's okay because you can go back once you have regulated your emotions, once you've had a chance to step away, once you've had a chance to gain a bit of perspective, and you can go back to that criticism, that feedback, and look at it more objectively. But interestingly, it isn't that negative feedback isn't what's going to help you grow necessarily. So just an interesting point to think about in terms of feedback, particularly if you're giving the feedback. If you're receiving it, there's not much you can do about that. But as you grow in your practice, as you give other people feedback, you might think about the impact that this article has. And there's a great section in the article that gives specific language you can use if you are the one giving feedback. Again, that's beyond the scope of today's webinar, but it's in the article and it's fantastic. So read it. It's a great, great article. And then the third point to highlight from that article is that excellence is idiosyncratic. So when we give feedback, right? Now, what the article suggests doing is if you're in a position of giving feedback is to highlight for others when they do something excellent. And I give the example of a coach, I think it was a football team coach who had a failing team. And so what he did was he would record them doing excellent plays, right, at their best. And then they would replay videos of those moments during the football game. And he would ask the player, what was it that you were thinking in that moment? What were you doing in that moment? So, number one is for yourself, right? If you're thinking about the times that you were excellent, when you're receiving feedback that is really positive, ask yourself what you were doing in that moment. What were you doing to create excellence? And excellence is idiosyncratic, means that each person has excellence that is individual to them. I like to think of musicians because they are all so different, right? If you think about Pavarotti, right, a star opera singer, and Michael Jackson, right, a pop icon, They are so different. They couldn't be more different from each other, and yet each of them is excellent in their own way. So when you think about excellence, and what this article highlights is that it's innate to you. Your version of excellence looks different from someone else's version of excellence, which is great. You can distinguish yourself. It also means that it cannot be taught, right? You can't have a excellence being here's what excellence, here's how you define excellence. You can in some ways define attributes, but ultimately that unique form of excellence is innate in the individual. It's idiosyncratic. So a few words about feedback. So hopefully this is going to give you a flavor of how to think about feedback. And again, if you've got questions, please do drop them in the Q&A or put them in the chat. So when you get to a law firm environment, feedback matters. Now, I mentioned before, because people are so busy, it is not always put on the top of the priority list, and you may find that you feel like you're lacking feedback. You don't receive as much of it as you want, which is why it's important to adopt a proactive role in soliciting and using feedback. So in a law firm environment, there are different types of feedback. There's formal feedback, which typically we think of as the performance review. If you're a summer student, you'll probably have a performance review this summer. As an articling student, you'll probably have one or two performance reviews. As an associate, there will be a schedule. It might be every 6 months, it might be once a year. If you're in a firm that is maybe I'm thinking of the larger firms typically have the highly structured processes in place. If you're a smaller firm or a firm where there are fewer formal processes, then you may have more informal reviews, or you may be the one who needs to instigate those reviews. But that is what we sometimes think about as feedback is this environment where you're getting a formal performance review. That is only one flavor, though, of feedback. There are many opportunities in a firm for informal feedback. So, what does informal feedback look like? It's really any feedback that you're receiving in the course of your work. Now, back when I used to practice, a lot of work happened on paper. And so I think of the red ink marking up the memo, the agreement, the submissions, whatever it was that I had just submitted, handed in paper form to a lawyer that I was working with. And I used to love the red ink. I mean, not love in the sense that actually, I used to love it because I was very curious to see what somebody else had to say about my work product. I viewed it as a gift. And I always had the mindset that what we're trying to do here is create the best work product for the client. And I have a fairly thick skin. So you may also feel that way, but that red ink is feedback, right? If it's a marked up track changes on a document, same thing. So sometimes you'll receive that feedback. The lawyer will mark up a document and give it to you. Sometimes they will take your work and they might make some changes and send it out to the client. If they don't give you a draft, what many students and lawyers do is they will take the two versions, what you sent over and what was delivered to the client, and run a copy, a black line or whatever you call it, to see what was different, right? And you might study those changes. You may even go back to the instruction lawyer and say, listen, I really wanted to see what the difference was between this and that. I noticed you made a few changes. I'm really interested in knowing why you made these two particular changes. The reason I say that is you might want to really focus in terms of the feedback you're asking for to make it less of a project. If it's an entire memo and there's, 30 different things that are changed, you might want to narrow it down a little bit again so that you're not overwhelming that person with a volume of feedback that they might not be able to make time for. So markups on a draft, the actual specific feedback on a draft, spoken feedback. So a lawyer might say something to you about something that you are doing. There's implicit feedback, like the volume of work. So if you do an assignment for an instructing lawyer and they come back and they give you more work, that's probably a pretty good sign that they were happy with what you did. If you stop receiving work from somebody, it may mean nothing. It may also mean that the work that you did wasn't to the quality that they wanted. And this does happen. And so you do want to keep an eye out for the volume of your work. And there's a reference here to podcast episode 181, Optimize Your Performance Review. So the podcast, of course, is my podcast. It's called The Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers, and it is applicable to more than women lawyers. I also have episodes that are, I mean, they're for pretty much all lawyers. Some are specific to some of the unique features of a practice that a woman would experience. But most of them, I would say, are applicable to all lawyers, and many are applicable to law students, some specifically, and some just by the nature of what we cover. Um, okay, so here we have, if you stop, thank you for this question. It's an excellent question. If you stop receiving work from someone, do you suggest finding the time and space to proactively ask them why? So I don't know that I would ask why they have stopped sending you work. I think I would approach it a little bit differently. Um, you might start out by going back to that person and expressing interest in doing more work for them to kind of test the waters. I think if you go back and ask them why they're not sending you work, it puts them in an awkward spot. I don't know that a lawyer would say to you in that context, I'm not sending you work because I didn't find what you did last time to be helpful. I don't know that anybody, most people will probably shy away from that. So I think I'd try to approach it a little bit more tangentially. Um, and I suppose you could potentially ask if you have someone at your firm, a professional development director, um, maybe you would talk to them about it, but it's delicate, and so I would potentially ask them, but it wouldn't be the lawyer who you're concerned about. I would be quite I would be quite strategic in my approach. So I think the first thing I would do is just to assess really what's going on in the department. Maybe they're not that busy. I would be proactive in maintaining or kind of assessing what's happening in that relationship. Make yourself available, assuming you want to do more work with them. Um, and if you don't have a chance to do more work for them, um, maybe think about do you need to have a conversation with a mentor or a professional development director about maybe how to approach that situation? I mean, if it's work that you've done and maybe it's really recent and you think that the timeline is still fresh enough that you could ask for feedback, that might be a way of approaching it. Hey, we had this file that we worked on recently and I did X, Y, Z for you. I'd love to circle back and hear how that went for you. If you have any feedback about, how what went well, maybe things to work on in the future. So that might be a way of approaching it as well. And I apologize, it's a bit of a rambling answer. I am thinking out loud, and I think it is a delicate situation. So um, you want to find a way to do that in a way that strategically is advantageous for you. So thank you. It's a really, really good question. Um, so if we go back to that these different types of feedback, so again, that drying up of the work, right? And again, it's a tough one because it could be the market. It could be that they are intentionally trying to staff other lawyers or students on a file for them to gain experience. There's lots of reasons. Maybe your hours are really high and they're trying to sort of pull back and give you a bit of a break. There's so many different reasons why the work might not be coming from a particular person. So hard to draw conclusions, but it can be a signal. Um, Other informal sources of feedback, self-reflection. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. In the sources of feedback. So when you're thinking about where that feedback comes from, lawyers will give you feedback, clients will give you feedback, the professional development director who is collecting feedback for performance reviews, they might give you feedback. If you are in front of a judge, the judge might give you feedback. So there's all these different sources of feedback. One of the most underrated sources of feedback is yourself, the ability to self-reflect, for you to sit down after anything that you do, any assignments, any projects, any conversations, and spend a few minutes reflecting on what just took place. And I'll give you the hack in a minute in terms of how you can do that to make it easy and something you can integrate into your practice. So you want to ask for feedback. So again, if you're in the middle of a closing and things are really busy and there's emergencies and emails flying everywhere, that's probably not the time to ask for feedback. But when the deal closes or the trial is done or the application is done or whatever it is has settled, that's when you want to go back to your instructing lawyer and say, hey, listen, I'd love to have a quick meeting with you. I think will be maybe 5, 10 minutes. I would love to ask for some feedback on whatever it is that we just worked on together. We can think about how we're going to approach the next one. And I'll give you these 3 questions in a minute and everything will make sense. And then points 4 and 5. We want to leverage that positive feedback. So this goes back to the idea of excellence being idiosyncratic and you seeing what is positive, right? What are people telling you that you do really well? What do you notice about yourself that you do really well? We want to lean into that. We want to build on your strengths where you're already strong and then learn from difficult feedback. So again, we want to take that growth mindset that we talked about previously, right? Here's some difficult feedback. What can I learn from it? This is not a sign that you are hopeless, that you're fixed where you are, that you're never going to recover. This is an opportunity to learn. So you want to extract as much value as possible from any negative feedback. Make it worth your time, right? Make it worthwhile. If you're going to have something and it's going to be considered a failure, which is a word I will almost never use, right? Failure is really just unmet expectations. But let's say something doesn't go to plan, it doesn't meet expectations. What can you learn about that? What was it, the instructions that maybe they were unclear? What was the problem there so that you can resolve that problem and learn from it moving forward. So, those are different ways of thinking about feedback in a law firm. Again, we want to leverage that feedback because sometimes we'll have performance reviews potentially, but we want feedback to be ongoing in between performance reviews as well. So the hack that I'm offering to you, and the reason I'm calling it a hack is because I want it to be simple and a reflex and something that you can do relatively easily. So the hack here, what worked, what didn't work, what will you do differently next time? And I put what will you do next time? Some of it will be the same, right? Some of the things you'll find you did really well. Other things you'll be like, nope, that didn't work out, so let's do it differently. But what will you do next time? And the reason you want to start with what worked, and I would encourage you to exhaust that first question is if you read that article about feedback, the feedback fallacy article, and you read about how positive feedback opens up our creativity. It puts us in, instead of that stress response, it's the rest and digest response. It puts us into the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's what opens up creativity. It makes you feel good. It makes you open to more. And so start with what worked. Give yourself a list. If you're doing a self-reflection, what are the things that you did really well? You clarified instructions, you knew the sources to go to, you asked for help when you needed it, you did whatever it happens to be. You reviewed your work product multiple times. You didn't have any typos, whatever it is. You want to really exhaust all the things that you did well. Then you're going to move on to what didn't work. And so, what were some of the challenges that you experienced? Maybe you spent too long in the drafting stage, or you weren't able to narrow down the number of cases to something that was digestible, or whatever it happens to be. So, what didn't work? And then, what will you do next time? What will you do that is the same? What will you do that is different next time? And these are questions that you can use with yourself. You can also use them with others. So, let's say you're seeking feedback from somebody. You might go to them and say, listen, we just closed this big project. What do we think went really well in this court hearing or with this closing? What do we think was really effective here? So you know to do that again. Where do we get stuck, right? What didn't work? And then you can develop your plan. What will we do next time? So it's a really easy way of approaching feedback. And because it's easy, I'm hoping that means that you'll be open to doing it. So any other questions? And again, I very much appreciate the questions. I feel like that really helps me see where your thinking is at. Okay, so we are going to move on to the exercise. And what I'd invite you to do here, and you can do these questions after today's webinar wraps up, is to think about how you're going to use feedback in your practice over the course of the summer. So here we might think about what will you be measuring, right? What are the goals that you have and how would you measure your success on those goals? What feedback would help you with that? Who could be a good source of feedback, right? Is that somebody that you're working with? Is it you as a source of feedback? How will you obtain the feedback? Do you need to set up a meeting with somebody? Could you be reviewing drafts? What will be the most effective way? And then what will you do with that feedback going forward? And then finally, we're here at communication. Now, communication in a professional environment is potentially different from what you are used to. If working in a law firm is the first time that you find yourself in an office environment, it can be a big shift and a big adjustment. Um, I know when I first started working at a law firm, it was very different from any environment I'd been in previously. And you might find that you're trying to figure out, how do you communicate with the lawyers that you work with? What is the appropriate protocol? One of the things that is really vital in the relationships that you have with the lawyers that you work with your fellow students is this idea of building trust and establishing confidence. And so this part of the session is really designed to help you with communication in a way that you build that trust and you instill that sense of confidence. So we're going to cover three different things here. Know your audience, have a clear message and call to action, and be a brand people trust. I initially had become a brand people trust, but let's just be that person now. So know your audience. This really is a starting point for any type of communication. You want to know who you're speaking to. So in your workplace, chances are you're going to be speaking with lawyers, you're instructing lawyers, maybe lawyers that you're speaking with at a social event. You may be speaking with clients of the firm. You may be asked to contact them for whatever reason, and so it's external clients. You might be speaking with assistants and clerks and people who are there to support you and the lawyers that you work with on your project. So first you want to know who they are. Then you want to think about their characteristics. So if you're working with a senior partner on a file, chances are they're really busy. Chances are they want you to help them with the correct answer. They want things to be concise. They want to feel like they can trust you, right? That you've done the work that they asked you to do. If you're working with an assistant, for example, what does your assistant want? Maybe they want a clear explanation of the task that they are being asked to do. They might want for you to be mindful of their timelines and giving them advance notice of maybe projects that might be coming up down the road. They might want feedback from you in terms of, was this done well? In which case you might be thinking about how you're engaging with them. And then what are their needs, right? What do they need from you as the person who's communicating with them? And here, what I encourage you to do is to make goodwill deposits with everybody who you work with. The idea here is, and this comes up quite a bit when I'm helping lawyers with their assistants or with lawyers that they're working with, is that sometimes, and for junior lawyers and students too, if you find that the only time that you're reaching out to somebody is to ask them for something, right? You only speak with them when you need them. Um, you're missing out on opportunities to establish a relationship with that person, a personal relationship. And people tend to respond better when they feel like they know you better. So if you've got an assistant, for example, and the only time you ever speak to them is when you want them to make a copy or send an email or file something, then there's less of a glue that is built up over time. So I encourage you to think about, and that's why we've got this good old deposits. Think of it like a bank account. You want to make deposits. This is true of the lawyers that you work with, right? If you see them in the hall, you see them at an event, and if some lawyers will be very busy and they won't have time to talk, but others will want to have those conversations. So have those conversations. That's really going to help you establish a relationship that can then sustain the communications. Now, I've referred here to episode 209 of the podcast, Build an Internal Market for Your Work. And if you haven't listened to that episode, encourage you to go to that episode because I talk in quite a bit of detail about how to approach the exercise of building a market for your work within your firm. Now, when you go to speak with somebody or you're writing to somebody, and this is where I think people have a lot of opportunities to build confidence, to gain trust. And and I refer here to a couple of podcast episodes. Again, highly recommend you listen to them. One is legal writing tips for law students with starting law firms with Amanda Haverstick. So she's an American coach, writing coach for lawyers. We did an interview on the podcast where she shares a number of really helpful, useful tips for students who are starting out at law firms. She herself has worked at big law firms, in-house, etc. So listen to that episode. There's some great tips about writing. And next week, there's another podcast episode that will come out. It's me interviewing Stephanie Mitchell. She is a coach who helps lawyers with clear communication. We talk about public speaking in the sense of formal context public speaking. So a presentation, a trip to court. What is also really essential in a law firm environment are those meetings that you have, those interactions you have on a day-to-day basis with the lawyers in the firm, the phone calls that you make to opposing counsel, the interactions you have with your client, interactions you have with other lawyers. There's a level of professionalism that is expected and that will earn you the trust and confidence that you want. And so that's what I'm thinking about here. When you're communicating within a firm, I would encourage you to always be prepared for those conversations. So if you're going to a partner's office to report on a mandate that you're working on, we want you preparing yourself ahead of time for that meeting. So I've got some tips here under that tip two. Have a clear intent. So if you're going to speak to somebody or you're about to make a phone call, I always recommend having a roadmap or an agenda for your conversation. What is it that you're going to do with the time? If you're going to speak with a lawyer, for example, I talk about setting expectations, you might want to let them know, listen, I'd love to talk to you about this file. I think we're going to need 5 minutes. I think we're going to need 10 minutes. Here's the thing that I want to talk to you about. You want to let them know what to expect from you. Set the agenda so that they're not surprised, they're not wondering, is this a 2 hour meeting? Is this a 5 minute meeting? When it comes to high value real estate, what I mean by that is whether you are speaking or writing, there are moments that are high value and moments that are low value, right? If you think about an email, that first portion of the email, that is high value real estate. So you want to make sure that you're communicating your key message in that portion of the real estate. Um, you may want to identify next steps. So this is really where we get to that call to action. If you have been working on a mandate for a more senior lawyer, and maybe you've reached a fork in the road. Maybe you're doing a research memo and you've discovered that there are two or three issues that weren't on the radar when the instructing lawyer first told you about the assignment. And so you're going back to that lawyer to seek clarity over whether or not to explore these different avenues. That would be an example where you may want to go to the lawyer. You want to have your roadmap here that we're going to talk about today. Here are the key points. Here's the next steps, right? We need to decide whether or not we're going to go ahead and do further research on these different areas. Um, you're asking them, right? This is where the call to action is. The call to action here is, can you make a decision here? And you're often going to want to offer your opinion, right? You've been doing the research. You might think that some of these are valuable to go down, and you might think some of them are not. So you want to say to that lawyer, here's what I think, right? And they may not agree with the opinion that you give, but they will appreciate that you've given an opinion. So what I encourage you to do here is to think about the conversation that you're going to have, the email that you're writing, the exchange. What is it that you're trying to communicate? What is it that you want that person to do? Again, going back to this theme of moving into action, right? That we want to be moving things forward. We want to be proactive. That call to action is what sets you up for a next step. And the reason I use the language, the CTA, and there's a click here button, is that websites and emails are typically very good at this, right? In the online space, they talk about this call to action, the CTA. So make it easy for the person who's working with you to identify what happens next. So one more, one more area here is be a brand people trust. So if you think about again that you've got these interactions with other lawyers and you want to establish trust, there's communication that is verbal, right? The words that you use, and there's communication that is a little bit more subtle. So the nonverbal communication. So what I'm encouraging you to do here is to think about verbally how you are communicating with the lawyers that you speak with, the clients that you speak with. And there's language that is powerful, and there's language that undermines your authority. So, common words that may undermine your authority, the word sorry. Now, this can come up in many examples. I see it often in emails where people will take time to respond to an email and they will say, sorry, that it took me so long. And then there's an explanation that follows, and then diving into the email. And my view on that is that sorry is probably appropriate sometimes, right? If it truly did take a long time, maybe it's days, or it's a super sensitive matter and maybe it took longer than expected, maybe it is appropriate to put an apology in writing or spoken. But my guess is that if you're someone who's using sorry often, that you don't need to. And a really great way to deal with that is to use the word thank you instead. So instead of writing, sorry, I'm late, or whatever, thank you for your patience. And then you can move forward. Just is another one. I'm just writing to say, I'm just writing with an update. I just wanted to. So again, screen your emails to see if you're using the word just and does it need to be there? And then finally, another example of language that might undermine your authority. Does that make sense? So you might hear people explain a concept and then they'll say something like, does that make sense? And it has the effect of undermining the credibility of what you've just shared. So instead of asking that question, you might ask them something more specific. Is there anything here that requires clarification? So again, you want to be conscious of the words that you're choosing and are you using language that is powerful? And are you avoiding words that might undermine your authority? And then finally, nonverbal communication. So I've got these images here because these are all different ways of holding your body that communicate. And the top right, sort of the power pose there, uh, is one that conveys authority and confidence. So does the guy in the chair, but he might seem a little bit too relaxed depending on the context. Being hunched over in the chair, probably not quite as commanding in terms of body language. But you want to think about the positioning of your body and whether or not you're using your body to, again, convey confidence. So if you're looking for, well, there's some obvious suggestions here. Stand tall, make eye contact, avoid upspeak. So upspeak is when you're talking and it sounds like a question, but it's not a question. And you might notice that. I notice it sometimes with students when they're preparing for interviews with law firms. Sometimes they'll end on an up note. You just want to make sure that you're ending on a down note. It makes you sound like you have greater authority. And a great resource for nonverbal communication is Amy Cuddy. She has a fabulous TED Talk all about presence and body language. She talks about how certain poses, this pose on the top right, that would be a super woman or a super person pose, that physiologically it actually has an impact on your levels of confidence and your ability to rise to the challenge. So we are almost at time here. And so if there are any questions, I'd encourage you to put them in the Q&A or the chat. Um, the exercise for this section is to define what confident communication looks like for you. So going back to what we just talked about, you're in a law firm environment. Your goal is to build trust. You're thinking about the people with whom you're interacting. You're prepared for the conversation. You've prepared your materials. You know what you want to say. You go in with confidence. You're avoiding language that is undermining your authority. What does that look like for you? So that will be different for everybody. It might be helpful to pick three words. That often is a nice way to do it. Confident communication for you might be authority, clear, and connecting. It might look different for somebody else. But again, define that for yourself, and that gives you an image to step into. So what we've covered here today, again, going back to this original theme, The goal is not just knowing what you need to do in order to thrive, but to bridge the gap between knowing what to do and doing it. So we talked about mindset and cultivating this growth mindset where you are thinking about growth versus fixed mindset, right? Instead of trying to protect Carol Dweck talks about being on this pedestal, the pedestal of perfection, right? Instead of trying to protect that, we're looking at getting into the arena, really testing and learning and growing, right? Because over time, that's how you're going to really advance in terms of your skills and in your growth professionally. And then decision forks, right? And you've got those opportunities, and on the one hand, you could play safe, right? Continue doing what you're already doing versus that opportunity that maybe feels like a stretch assignment. We want you stretching. We want you acting in those decision forks. When it comes to feedback, we've talked about what feedback is. We've talked about feedback being subjective. We've talked about feedback being information, how it might be difficult to process difficult feedback in the moment. We've talked about feedback and affirm, so informal and formal sources. We've talked about using your own self-evaluation as a form of feedback. And then those three questions: what worked, what didn't work, what will you do differently next time? And then finally, communication. Know your audience, have a clear message, right? Know what you want to say, know what that next step is going to be, what is your call to action? And then finally, be a brand that people trust. So use your body language, use your language in a way that conveys confidence, that instills trust. So that's what I have for you today. I will be sharing the slides. I do not see any questions, and so I'm going to assume that everyone has understood what we are talking about today and that you don't have questions. If you're watching the recording and you have questions, feel free to send them my way. I'd absolutely love to hear from you. It's really been a pleasure having you here. Thank you for joining me today. I wish all of you a successful summer. I hope that what we've covered today is helpful and relevant to you, that you're able to really embrace that growth mindset. Again, if you've got questions, send them my way. I encourage you to listen to the podcast episodes that I referenced here, as well as the other resources. So thank you again for joining me here today. I look forward to reconnecting with you again soon. Bye for now.